Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in. This is Caitlin Sider, I'm a Policy Associate at the National Housing Conference. In the room with me, I've got Lisa Sturdivant, who is NHC's Vice President for Research and the Director of the Center for Housing Policy. I also have Amy Clark, who is NHC's Director of Marketing and Communications. And we've got a great presentation for you on veterans research and the communications toolkit that have come out of NHC. And I wanted to give a big thank you to Capital One for sponsoring this event. And I also just wanted to preface this webinar by saying that this is work that NHC is really committed to. And I think we've seen a lot of work in 2015 around veterans homelessness and the effort to end veterans homelessness. And we've seen that in communities like Salt Lake City, New Orleans, and just recently the state of Virginia announced that they had effectively ended homelessness. So this is something that the National Housing Conference is very committed to, and we have future plans to work on. So as I said, I've got our two presenters in the room, so they'll both do their presentations, and then we'll have time for question and answers at the end, and then we just have a few quick announcements for you guys. So I just wanted to go over some technical details. You can submit your questions through the question box in your GoToWebinar software, and we will be compiling those and have a list at the end. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Lisa.
Thank you, Caitlin. Welcome everyone to the webinar. Looking forward to sharing some of our most recent research with you. With support from the Home Depot Foundation, NHC and the Center for Housing Policy have done this work around veterans housing, and we've analyzed trends in the demographic characteristics of the U.S. veteran population and looked at their housing needs and the ability of existing HUD and VA and other programs that are designed to meet their needs. So as Caitlin mentioned, and as this report acknowledges, progress has really been made, particularly around veterans homelessness. But this report highlights how the housing needs of veterans will change dramatically over the coming years. And we offer some suggestions for directions for policy to meet those needs. But we also want to stress how important it is to continue to track the changing demographic and economic characteristics of U.S. veterans to be in the best position to be able to respond to their housing needs. So our research report is focused around three veteran groups. We focused on female veterans with children, we focused on post-9/11 veterans, and then on older veterans. And we selected these groups of veterans because they are among the fastest growing veteran populations, and they also represent populations that have some unique housing challenges. By and large, we use data from the 2013 American Community Survey to analyze characteristics of these populations. So starting first with our female veterans with children, there are currently 2.3 million female veterans in the United States, and about 350,000 female active duty and selected reserve members who serve in locations around the country and around the world. So women, and particularly single mothers, as you can see from this chart, make up a very small share of veterans. There are currently about 150,000 veterans that, who are single mothers. But the numbers are growing. So in 2012, women made up about 15% of active duty forces, which is an increase from 11% in 1990. In fact, when you look at the number of post-9/11 veterans, so veterans who have served since 2001, 1 out of every 5 of these post-9/11 veterans is a woman. And then, according to projections from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the share of female veterans is projected to rise from about 8% now to nearly 18% by 2040. Affordable housing challenges and homelessness can be substantial problems for female veterans. Nearly 1/4 of single veteran mothers live in poverty. Women veterans are much more likely than non-veteran women to be homeless, and while the data are sometimes hard to come by, it's estimated that between 20 and 45% of homeless women veterans have children. And as we'll talk about, many housing programs that serve veterans aren't well equipped to serve women with their children. So just another word about the challenges that that female veterans with children face. Some subgroups of female veterans face disproportionate housing challenges. The National Center on Homelessness Among Veterans found that the risks of homelessness were greater among younger female vets, particularly young African American women. Housing instability and high housing cost burdens are common among female veterans, but low-income female veterans and single female veterans with children were most likely to face these burdens. Single mothers are a particularly vulnerable population. Many return from military service and face major challenges that put them at increased risk of homelessness. They often lack support in overcoming these obstacles to provide and to care for their families as they transition into civilian life. Half of single veteran mother households were cost burdened in 2012, and that compares to about a quarter of all veteran-headed households in that same year. And what the research has found is that at least some of the economic challenges faced by female veterans are associated with broader socioeconomic characteristics that predate their military service. For example, in a recent survey, about 42% of female veterans had said they joined the military due in part to a lack of other job opportunities. They've also found that some women recruits may see the military as a chance to escape from unstable home environments. And so what the research has really shown is that female vets, therefore, may be more susceptible to difficulties transitioning from military to civilian life as a result of weaker supports and other socioeconomic disadvantages. As I mentioned, a lot of the programs that we see offered by HUD and the VA are not often well designed for families or single mothers in particular. And so I wanted to highlight an example of a project that we highlighted in our report called Help Philadelphia Homes. So to better serve female veterans and their children, oftentimes organizations will look to build permanent supportive housing that includes units sized for families. So Help Philadelphia Homes constructed supportive housing units for disabled veterans, and this development includes several 3-bedroom apartments, which are designed to house families with children. And so the project was really targeted towards disabled veterans and female veterans in particular with children. But the organization running the project found that finding families to fill those units was difficult. The units for single veterans were much easier to fill. And so one of the challenges that this project bumped up against was connecting female veteran mothers with housing that meets their needs. And some of the research highlights some of the problems in connecting female veterans to housing programs were that female veterans often feel disconnected from the Veterans Administration. They often, when asked, won't call themselves veterans. And then when it comes to finding housing that is suitable for them and for their children, sometimes it's a mismatch between where the housing is or the type of housing and their desire to live in different types of housing. So such as in single-family housing, for example. So in the case of Help Philadelphia Homes, just one of the units has been rented to a single mother who's a disabled veteran. And so this ongoing challenge of linking units to female veterans is something that continues to be a learning process for the Help Philadelphia Homes project. So I want to shift gears and talk about post-9/11 veterans. So the attacks of September 11th inspired many men and women to serve our country by joining the armed forces. And at this point, many of the service members have completed tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan and in other armed conflicts around the world, and now are returning home. And with the attacks of 9/11 more than a decade behind us now, many service members are now veterans, and this group of veterans will be growing in the coming years. So in 2012, there were 1.8 million post-9/11 veterans. There's estimates that that number will almost double over the next 10 years. And what the research has found on these veterans is that many post-9/11 veterans can face challenges transitioning their military experience into private sector employment. And this particular population of veterans has been entering the civilian labor market during one of the weakest economic situations we've had in decades. So there are places where veterans can find employment, but there might be a mismatch between the experience required and the veteran's skills. Many other veterans are unable to work due to a disability incurred during their military service or for other reasons. But what we find is when you look at post 9/11 veterans and compare their labor market characteristics with civilians, with non-veterans in that 18 to 34-year-old age group, this is a group that's actually doing better in terms of their incomes and their employment when they've returned from service. But that doesn't mean they don't face challenges. And one of the key things that we found is that so many of these job prospects that veterans are finding as they return from service are in high-cost areas. So job growth is happening where housing costs are highest. And more than 1/3 of post 9/11 veterans households are cost burdened. And there are many metropolitan areas in which a veteran returning from service in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, can't afford to rent a typical apartment, and even fewer are able to afford to buy a home. So we do every year a report called Paycheck to Paycheck, where we look at a number of different occupations and their wages and their ability with those wages to be able to afford to rent or buy a home. And so if we looked at the median wage for veterans who are aged 18 to 34, so no matter what civilian job they're in now, we looked and see if those wages were sufficient to rent or buy a home in the 50 largest metros. And so it turns out that there are only 6 metropolitan areas around the country where a typical post 9/11 veteran can afford to buy a home. And those are Buffalo, Indianapolis, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, and Raleigh. So these tend to be places that where job prospects haven't been, in most cases. Raleigh is really an exception there, but where job prospects haven't been so strong, but where housing costs are low. And so when these post 9/11 vets are looking for job prospects, they're often finding themselves in these high-cost markets where it's difficult to afford to rent or buy a home. So this idea of linking housing opportunities along with job training or employment training or other sort of skills training really provides some opportunities for organizations that are interested in serving this growing and frankly this very diverse group of veterans. One example is Operation Homefront Village, which is located in Gaithersburg, Maryland, outside here of Washington. And this is a housing development that houses veterans and their families, and it gives preference to individuals with disabilities and service members who have recently returned from duty. And the program focuses on service members with families, and what they found is that most are occupied by veterans of the most recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is actually a housing development that is financed with private sources, including donations from foundations and from private sector sources. And it connects veterans with employment and financial management resources. So every family has a case manager who checks in every 30 days or so to learn about progress towards employment and financial stability. Every family gets a financial coach, and case managers connect residents with various nonprofits that provide or connect residents with employment-related training and other services. Because the program doesn't receive federal funding from HUD or money from other state programs, it actually has a lot of flexibility in how it works with the veterans and their families and the services they're able to offer, and frankly the requirements that they're able to ask of the residents. And so one key part is this idea of financial coaching allows residents to save money and to potentially be putting that money towards a down payment so that ultimately they can become homeowners. Finally, I want to turn to the older veteran population, and older veterans are an important segment of the current veteran population. In 2012, there were 14.1 million veterans aged 55 and older, and this population is the majority, almost 2/3 in fact, of all living veterans in the United States are aged 55 and older. And so if you look around at the people aged 55 and older in the population, about 17% of people aged 55 or older are veterans. I like to tell people, I don't get surprised by a lot of statistics, but that number surprised me. that if you think about it, almost 1 in 5 people that you meet who are age 55 and older are a veteran of one of our from the service. And so, this is an important population. The largest cohort of veterans in the U.S. includes those who served in the Vietnam War, of which there are about 6.8 million Vietnam War veterans. The number of older veterans has reached its peak, and over the coming decades, though, this population, as they age, will face a diverse set of housing needs. So older veterans may require modest home modifications or accessible rental units as they get older, and their mobility becomes impaired. Others may need home and community-based health services to help them age in place. And homeless or near homeless older veterans can require intensive outreach and services to ensure they have stable housing. Older veterans, like older adults in the civilian population, have increased physical limitations, and these health problems can increase as they age. So remember, we're talking about a really big population, and nearly 35% of veterans aged 55 and older report a service-related disability. While housing and supportive services are available to assist veterans with service-related disabilities, this is going to be a growing need over time as this aging veteran population has increasingly complex physical and health needs, and the existing resources may not be sufficient. The older veteran population does include some of our most vulnerable veterans, including those who are simply, the oldest of the old. About 7% of the overall veteran population right now is currently age 85 or older. When we look at the housing challenges faced by this population, about 2.5 million older veteran households, that's about 24% of all households headed by veterans age 55 or older, are housing cost burdened. And so people who rent, older veterans who rent, are even more likely to be cost burdened. The prevalence of cost-burdened households really does vary considerably across the country, and some places with the largest veteran populations are places where the cost burden is also greatest. So the highest share of cost-burdened older veteran households, for example, is in New Jersey, where 35% of these households are burdened. Now, despite these affordability challenges that we see here, it turns out that households headed by older veterans are actually less likely to be cost-burdened than older civilian households. And that turns out to be largely because of their higher average income and greater likelihood of being homeowners. The number of homeless veterans has declined steadily since 2010, but older veterans continue to be vulnerable to homelessness, particularly those with unstable economic situations or for whom alcohol or drug dependency is a problem. As we look at this growing population, though, even those for whom affordability is not the problem, or maybe including those for whom affordability is a problem, many older veterans will face obstacles to aging in their homes or in their communities. And as has been widely reported, a vast majority of older Americans would prefer to remain in their homes for as long as possible as they age. But physical limitations can make that difficult. The VA has several programs that help wounded and disabled veterans pay for modifications to homes. And as we look at this population, and frankly just the numbers, those types of programs are going to be in more demand in the years and decades to come. So as this population ages, many older veterans will require additional assistance in order to manage chronic health conditions. Assisted living facilities, service-enriched housing options that provide supportive services, these are going to be the kinds of places that are going to be in more demand. And many of these facilities can really be expensive, and assisted living facilities in general can be unaffordable to low-income older adults. So there have been places that have been trying to meet this need, and one example is the Oasis at Scholars Landing in Atlanta, which as of the writing of this report last year was under construction. And it's an affordable assisted living that offers services to older veterans and their spouses, and includes assistance completing activities of daily living and housekeeping, medication management, and so on, transportation services in order to go to doctor's appointments. And in order to make this project affordable to low-income veterans, the developer and housing manager have worked to create a financing plan that uses a number of different subsidies, including LIHTC, project-based housing choice vouchers, as well as other resources from both federal and state organizations. So, with this, I wanted to just provide some background for some of the characteristics of the veteran population and what their housing needs are. The full report is available on the website, and we'll have a link to that at the end of the presentation. And as we have a conversation here on this webinar, just wanted to make sure that you all are aware that NHC really is committed to doing future work around projecting needs based on demographic and economic characteristics of the changing veteran population, and to help support conversation around the types of programs and services that are best able to meet those needs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy Clark, who's going to talk about NHC's Veterans Housing Communications Toolkit.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. I hope everyone can hear me okay. As Caitlin shared, I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at the National Housing Conference. And the Veterans Housing Communications Toolkit is something that we produced with the generous support of the Home Depot Foundation. It covers communications tips for working with 3 audiences: community members of prospective veterans housing developments, veterans themselves, and policymakers. So in the first tool, we cover talking to community members, and the toolkit outlines a few of the common concerns that community members have about veterans housing developments. As with just about any affordable housing development, we've learned from the field that the common concerns are there around changes to property values, traffic impacts, impacts on schools. But in a situation where veterans are the residents, particularly veterans who are in need of supportive housing, the impact of the veterans themselves on the community, or the perceived impact of veterans on the community, is a much more significant concern. Community members tend to sometimes believe that veterans may have drug addiction or mental health problems, or we've even heard reports of community members being concerned that veterans would have some kind of intent to harm children. Obviously, all of us who work in housing understand that these perceptions are misguided. But if you think about it, if you believed, if you had reason to believe, even if it wasn't true, that these potential impacts were coming to your community, you would have reason to be concerned. And so I think even though these concerns are significantly misguided, it's important to treat them with the significance that they have. So we have a few different communications challenges here. First of all, we can't just share facts and convince people of what's true. Research has, as disappointing as that may be, research has shown that particularly when people have kind of ingrained ideas, data, because of confirmation bias, because of other biases, data is not actually going to change our minds. And I think we can all imagine or look back at times in our lives where we've avoided a certain set of facts, or we haven't believed what we've been told because it would change what we've already decided is true. So instead of going to facts, we have to find something else. In addition to this, our minds are not blank slates. All of our perspectives, all of our the way that we understand and interpret new information, all of that is shaped by the experiences that we've had, things we heard in the media, things we've been told by other people, received wisdom, all of that. And those create what we call frames, the lenses through which we see the world. And I would imagine that as housing developers or providers or advocates, our perspectives, our frames are going to be a lot different from that of the average community member who doesn't work in the field that we do. And so it is very possible to accidentally, with the language that we use about the work that we do, trigger negative frames with our audiences, with community members that get us off on a very wrong foot in conversation and make it difficult to continue forward and build support for our work. So what do we do? On the communication side, we need to reframe the conversation. I think the most important thing to do is to understand the perspective of our audience. So what has been their experience as a neighborhood? What is their experience as individuals? Have they seen housing developments come into their community and go wrong, or have they been told that story? What's the media narrative right now in your community about people who are homeless, about people who are low income, about people who are veterans or maybe have similar problems to the clients that you're going to be serving? And the next thing you need to do is really consider those concerns and figure out how the work that you do, the values that you bring to it, aligns with the things that they care about, and then make sure that your language steers away from triggering those negative images, triggering the fears and the negative frames that they may have about your work. So this is all really vague, right? Last spring for Shelterforce, I wrote an article about the same topic, communicating about veterans housing, and I had the opportunity to interview Nancy Hughes-Moyer from Volunteers of America, Illinois. They've done a lot of great development of housing for veterans, and she told me the story of their efforts to develop Hope Manor, which is their first veterans-focused housing development. And that project almost died because of community opposition. And fortunately, a sympathetic alderman stepped in along with a very supportive city housing division to combine with the great work of Volunteers of America to make it succeed. But this is a development for homeless veterans. And what Nancy told me about it, I will never forget this quote: "You could say homeless former presidents of the United States and it wouldn't have mattered in the situation." This was the area where the building was intended to be sited, had suffered from decades of disinvestment. The people who lived there were themselves, many of them potentially qualified for subsidized housing themselves. They weren't extremely low income, but they were struggling, and they didn't want homeless people in their community. They wanted a Starbucks, they wanted a Walgreens, they wanted something that would lift their neighborhood up after years of being on a downward slide. And the second they heard it was homeless veterans, they didn't care about the veteran part. They were concerned about the homeless part. So for this kind of situation where it's a community that has a lot of concern about its potential, talking about homelessness wasn't the way to go straight out. What Nancy said Volunteers of America has ended up doing is they will use terms like housing for veterans who are having trouble with employment and housing. I think there are a lot of us who have been people or who know people or have people in our families who have had trouble with employment and with their housing. That's relatable in a way that homelessness was not, particularly for this community that really saw itself at risk. So that's what I mean about reframing. On the outreach side, you need to build allies, and you need to build them early. So one of the things that Volunteers of America did, and I know a lot of other housing developers do, is do their own research early to identify who are potential supporters, who are the leaders in the community. As I think we all know, it's not always the person who heads up the neighborhood council who is the one person or the one voice that you have to pay attention to. Doing that research on your own and mapping that out will help you build alliances and learn the kind of opposition that you're likely to face. Vocal, visible support from elected officials can be very important, particularly in places where there is a political process that's involved in approval of affordable housing developments. I know Volunteers of America, Illinois in particular, will not go forward with a project unless they have that vocal, visible support from an elected official. It's often not enough to get the behind doors, closed doors promise. You need an elected official who's going to stick her or his neck out for you. So going directly to them, building alliances with people in the community who you know they trust and are close to is going to be important. And then think about the way that you structure your community engagement. It's not always the best way to go to have a big open meeting with one microphone in the middle of the floor and letting everyone say their piece. One-on-one meetings and small group outreach can be very important, particularly early in the process when you want to get an honest sense of what people think, what the problems are going to be, and who your potential allies are. The second tool in the toolkit is about talking to veterans. Common concerns for talking to veterans. I think there's a lot of military culture and service ideas that play into the way veterans see themselves and see the world that compounds some of the natural feelings that all of us have about being in the kind of difficult situation that someone might find themselves in if they are having trouble with housing. Service, of course, is a huge value for many former military personnel, and it can be difficult for any of us, but particularly if you've been part of a military service culture, to accept that you might need help, and that can be a tremendous barrier to veterans coming forward and getting the services that are available to them and that they need. The sort of loyalty and group component of military culture, I think, is also significant. I think a lot of service members don't want to let others down. They don't want to come forward with issues and be singled out as being different or unable to do their job or take care of themselves and take care of others. And then, as Lisa shared, a lot of people who we would consider veterans don't consider themselves veterans. Particularly, this is a challenge when it comes to female veterans, but it can apply broadly as well. And so the people we're trying to market to and communicate with might not even realize that the work we're doing is for them. Communication solutions. So again, reframing the conversation here is key. Incorporating some of the values that underlie military service and using some of the language around the military. In the slides that Lisa shared, there was a development called Operation Homefront. The Stand Down for Homeless Veterans is a program that's successful around the country that mimics the idea of a stand down that happened during the Vietnam War to let soldiers step back and regroup and get the things that they needed before they went back out into the front lines. Incorporating those sorts of concepts and values can help service members see themselves as part of your work. Another thing that you can do is just change your language a little bit. So maybe it's not housing for veterans, maybe it's housing for those who served, maybe it's housing for former military personnel. Just making those slight changes can help potential residents understand that it's really them that you're trying to help. On outreach, engage veterans as allies and as spokespeople. From the beginning of the development process, you can bring veterans in, particularly those who may be potential clients, if you're able to identify them through your own organization or maybe an organization you partner with, but bring them in and make them part of the process. I think there's potential to get some good ideas from them and ensure that your development is going to be of even better fit for them. But it's also a way for veterans from the beginning to see this as an opportunity for them, not only to receive help, but to help others. And then this is a no-brainer, but incorporate the voices of veterans in your marketing materials. And I think you can feel comfortable in even including statements about if you have them from testimonials from veterans that address the fact that maybe they didn't feel comfortable accepting help or that it was difficult for them, but they feel better for doing it if that's a testimony that you have available. And then look for ways for veterans who are residents of your developments to continue to be part of the community and to be of service. Volunteers of America, Illinois, in their Hope Manor development, has a partnership with the local elementary school where their residents volunteer, they do service projects. Of course, it's fantastic PR for veterans, for the development, for the organization, but it's also a way for veterans to contribute and to feel like they're part of something positive, and it's something that I think is attractive to potential residents as well. And finally, our third tool is about talking to policymakers. So, common concerns of policymakers, of course, policymakers are community members, right, just like anyone else. So they often share other common concerns, whether it be about public safety, traffic impacts, education impacts, property values. But as an elected official, there's a greater role that they have, which often turns them towards concerns with how effective a program model is going to be. I think particularly in a supportive housing context, if you're working with an elected official who is unfamiliar, say, with the Housing First model, it can be a little bit scary to accept the idea that someone with some significant challenges in their life is going to receive affordable housing supposedly without strings attached. And so there is a significant amount of education there that would need to be done to help them understand. And then, of course, elected officials are interested in where tax dollars are going. They have to be able to report back to the rest of their constituents that, you know, they're doing a good job with public resources. So that's a big concern as well. And of course, we are in a moment where we are aware of this more than ever, but you know, elected officials tend to be concerned about their reelection prospects, and a development that goes wrong or a community that is upset about a development that they supported could potentially be a source of difficulty as they seek reelection and try to continue their work in public office. So on the communication side, there's a few things we can do here. First of all, leveraging values. While appealing to patriotic values, I think tends not to be effective with community members in general because as we discussed earlier, it's really about, the concern is about much more than just the person being a veteran. From a political perspective, helping veterans, honoring heroes, aiding those who served, there's great value to that for elected officials. There are countless bills that have been introduced in Congress to provide housing and other services for veterans. There's definitely sort of positive political capital that can be built through that, so you can appeal to those ideas. I think you can also remind policymakers that there is widespread support for armed service members, at least in general. In 2013, the Pew Research Center did a survey that showed that 79% of Americans believe that armed service members have a lot of value in the community. In your area, there may be more local data that speaks to that, but in general, people support the military and they support service members and believe that they should be helped when they come home if they need it. And then this is a place where data, I think, can be really effective and is necessary. You know, as people who work in housing, we know that the work that we do is expensive, but it's also incredibly cost-effective compared to doing nothing or doing intervention without a housing component. Share that data. And I think you can also share examples of similar programs that have worked locally, whether it's something that your organization was involved in or whether it's another organization. Showing that there are solutions and that they have worked is an incredibly compelling way to do advocacy in any context, and particularly when there are sort of significant specific concerns as there might be around veterans housing. So on the outreach side, connect policymakers to what you do. Tours of veterans housing for elected officials and their staff are incredibly useful. It gives them stories that they can tell. If you have a legislative staffer who is meeting veterans, looking at the computer lab, talking with people, seeing that your developments look just like the apartment that they live in, right? That's incredibly compelling. The reality, of course, of policymakers is that they don't always care about housing, but they care about other things. And a little research will tell you what their policy platform issues are, and whether it's healthcare or education or economic development or something else, there are solid connections you can make between affordable housing and its impact on those issues. So build messages around that and communicate with your policymakers in that way. And then there are cases, I think, when you or even a veteran might not be the best messenger in communicating with policymakers about the positive impacts of your work. For example, if a policymaker is really concerned about public safety, they may rather hear from a police chief, right, about the positive impact of your work than from you. So cultivate those messengers who can tell that different side of the story. So briefly, I want to take you through a little exercise. Each of the tools in the toolkit has an exercise at the end, and this ripple effects exercise is part of the policymakers tool. So in perhaps an NHC webinar first, I'm going to ask you to find a piece of paper and a writing implement, and just write the name of a resident or a client in the middle of that piece of paper. This could be a real person or someone who's maybe sort of a composite of the people who you ordinarily serve. And I'm going to go ahead and use the female veteran with a child example from Lisa's presentation. So I don't know how well you can see this. The color's a little funky, but now that you've got the client name written down, take a second to write down the sort of stabilizing systems that are part of this resident or client's life now that they're engaged with your work. Obviously, they have affordable housing, but what else is going on? Do they have access to healthcare now that they've been stabilized? Is this single mother on WIC now that she's got a caseworker and can help her sign up for things? Does she have a financial coach who's helping her get that part of her life in line? What are the stabilizing systems that are part of this client's life? Then I also want you to write down a little bit about the positive personal changes that this client has experienced because of all of these stabilizing systems. So now that she has a financial coach, does she have a budget? Now that she's in housing, has her mood changed? Has she been able to deal with some mental or physical health challenges that she's had before? What are some of the personal changes that she's had in her life because of your work? Then move out a little bit further and think about the employment changes that she's experienced. So is this veteran going to your computer lab every day in your development and applying for new jobs? Is she in a training program? Has her attendance at work improved? What are some of the changes that she's experienced on that front? And then the last thing I want you to write down and to think about is the family changes that this client has experienced. So is her child doing better in school? Is her child healthier? Is she making or renewing connections with extended family that she didn't have before, but now she's in a better place emotionally to do that? Write down the family changes that have occurred. So as you're thinking about this and looking at the systems that have stabilized this client and all the changes that have happened in her life because of having access to affordable housing, you're sort of building the whole landscape of organizations and people who are part of the work that you do. This is going to give you some clues as to who your messengers could be. So think about who can tell the story in each category. Her child's teacher could speak to his improvements at school. That financial coach can talk about how she understands budgeting now and is excited to deal with her finances instead of being afraid. Once you have a list of these potential messengers, the next thing to do is really think about what you would need to do to cultivate these individuals and whether you have the kind of relationships and connections with them that would allow you to get the information you would need to tell this kind of story or to engage them, as I said, in being messengers themselves. So that was a rapid run through this exercise, but this exercise and others are available in the Veterans Housing Communications Toolkit. You'll get more contact information from me later. I want to show you where these publications are on our websites. And while I'm doing this, I want to encourage you to share your questions for us. We have some time to take as many questions as we can. So we want to be able to do that. Please go ahead and type your questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar console, and we will answer as many as we can. And we'll also make the slides and other resources available to you by email within a couple of days after the webinar has concluded. So if you're interested in finding the research publication that Lisa was discussing, you can go to nhc.org, hover over the research menu, click on Research Library, and if you, on the Research Library page, you'll see our full menu of all the topics we cover. Click on Veterans, and it'll show you the housing and service needs of our changing veterans population publication, as well as our other veterans-related work. If you're interested in finding the Veterans Housing Communications Toolkit, you can go to hub.nhc.org, click on Toolkits, and click on Veterans Housing Communications Toolkit. On the Toolkit main page, you'll see links that go to 3 different PDFs that will open up in separate windows, and you can read them online or print them out.
Great. Thank you so much to both Lisa and Amy. So we're going to move into a question and answer period now. And like Amy said, we've got a few questions here, and I encourage you to continue submitting them, and we'll try to get as many as we can in before we need to wrap up. So one question we've received so far is, how do we connect to disabled female veterans in upstate New York? And I think this question can be generalized to just rural areas in general. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. How do we connect to disabled female veterans in rural areas?
So I think that, and I'll turn it over to Amy if she has suggestions on the communications front. I think that the issue of connecting with veterans in rural areas is a particularly important one. Those are often places where resources aren't quite as available as in suburban or more urban environments. And so what we found in some of our research on housing and services is that looking for partners that are already working with that population, whether it's the healthcare facility or whether maybe it's the university that's running, some health services. That we highlighted one rural housing services program in Iowa that was basically a mobile RV that would go from home to home and meet with clients who weren't able to travel to the hospital. So finding out whether there are people that are already connecting with this population in some other way seems to me the best way to connect with folks at the rural level. Amy, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, Lisa, I think that probably is the best option. And if you do have good relationships with those organizations, find out sort of their screening procedures and see if you can work with them on the language that they use to suss out whether someone, say, is a veteran, because I think there, again, is a place where you sort of run into difficulty. And so, if there are more oblique questions instead of just asking, oh, are you a veteran, they might be able to catch more people who would qualify, who are veterans but don't necessarily see themselves as such.
Great, thank you. So Lisa, I believe this question is for you, and it says, concerning the housing project designed for women with children, are there housing choice and fair housing issues when limiting occupancy this way?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting question, and I think that's come up in some communities, that there's this idea that you have a difficulty in how you market different properties so that you're not violating fair housing laws, right? And so I think that there's a good question there that localities need to look at when it comes to what sources of funding are being used to build the housing and to manage the housing. And so I think that on a community by community basis, you would need to be really clear about how it is you're approaching families with children and making them aware of these kinds of properties. But I think that's a really good question. I'm glad that they brought it up, because I don't know if we know as much as we should about how local jurisdictions are approaching that.
We got another one here. How do we find the older disabled veterans or older veterans who might be aging in place, and how do we connect them with the services?
So I'll give one example. We're all aging, so right. So in some ways, this is an issue that's broader than just the aging veteran population, and so this is a conversation about enabling older adults to age in community that communities across the country are having. And so, again, as Amy mentioned, I think there's one thing about having conversations with people who are connecting with older adults and helping to identify people who may have served in the military, not by just asking, oh, are they veterans, but maybe talking to them to figure out what their military experience might have been. But I think what we're finding is that this need for a conversation generally about how to enable older adults to age in community and to age at home, communities are starting to have these conversations. This is starting, there's a realization that, every day 10,000 people turn 65. And this wave of baby boomers is just now beginning to reach this age of 65 and 60. The leading age is actually 68. And so I think there are many things that we can't plan for, that are really difficult to plan for, but this aging of the population and this desire for this population to live at home, and frankly the cost effectiveness of enabling this population to live at home, is one that communities really should be aware of, and the extent to which that overlaps with this desire to serve the veteran population, I think those efforts can really be worked together jointly. So working with community groups that are already working with an aging population seems to be really important in this phase.
We got another question that came in and says, where can we find resources for the type of support facilities that you mentioned, Lisa, outside of the ones that you mentioned?
So that's a good question too. So we had highlighted there are three that are highlighted, three of those examples highlighted in this presentation. There are 3 additional programs that are highlighted in the report, so I'll turn your attention to that. There's also a Veterans Housing and Services report that NHC published 2 years ago that contains additional case studies and profiles, particularly focused on the financing piece of rental housing. And so I'll direct your attention to those as well. You know, after you have a chance to explore those case studies and profiles, feel free to shoot us an email and we can help direct you to other sources. There are many organizations around the country that are working on veterans housing issues. Volunteers of America in particular that Amy mentioned would also be a good place to contact to understand the types of properties and projects that they've been working on.
Great, thank you. I'll probably just do one more question here, and this one's for Lisa. And so, in talking about Operation Homefront, you mentioned that this project has no HUD funding and it has greater flexibility on how it works. And they're hoping you could expand on the greater flexibility.
So the greater flexibility has to do with some of the requirements that the property managers and the case managers put on households receiving the housing. So for example, there are meetings between case managers and the families, and there are meetings between financial counselors, for example, and the veterans. And those meetings are required in order to continue to receive housing services. And so in some cases, some people might say, oh, that's really strict and that's really punitive, but because of the, you know, the fact that they don't have to, that they're funded primarily by private sources, they have decided to put this structure in place, and they found that those meetings and those interactions end up being really important for financial stability of families going forward.
Great. Well, that ends our question and answer period. And I just want to thank Lisa and Amy again for their great presentations. And so on this slide that you're seeing here, we have some links. Those are links to Lisa's research and to Amy's toolkit. And then that next link is from the Housing Assistance Council. And so they compiled a veterans data central database. And it's a simple, easy-to-use online resource that provides essential information on the social, economic, and housing characteristics of veterans in the United States. And that second link just came out today. It's from the Urban Institute, and it's their Veterans Homeless Prevention Demonstration Evaluation. So they just released their research report today, and accompanying their report is a photo essay. So we want to make you guys, everyone, aware of those resources. And also there is our contact information. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we'll happily direct you. But thank you again for joining our webinar, and I will release you back into your days.